Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. So there's been a lot going on recently with the Direct program out of TCGplayer, and in the vein of our friend Mason at Cardinal Gaming, I wanted to put on my tinfoil visor and let you know my conspiracy theory about what it all means and where it's all going. And so what I will say is I have very low confidence, and that's why I bring the visor out, is so that as you watch this video, you know I have very low confidence in this theory that I'm putting forward. I would say there's probably about a 5% chance of this being the correct future that we're headed towards. So a couple weeks ago, TCGplayer started sending out some emails to direct sellers, basically talking about needing to improve their accuracy rates on their replenishment invoices. And in case you're just on the buyer side and you don't know how it works for the sellers, essentially, when we as direct sellers sell a card through the direct program, TCGplayer then a couple days later sends us an invoice that scoops up all the cards we sold through direct and says, okay, now it's time to send TCGplayer those cards to replenish their inventory in Syracuse. And so we get together all those cards and we package them up and we mail them to Syracuse, and then TCGplayer inspects them when they get there and they put them into their inventory. However they do that, that's a black box to me. So they do that, and they will have discrepancies. And a discrepancy is when TCGplayer believes that what you sent them is not what you were supposed to send them. And now discrepancies can come in several different flavors. You can forget to send a card or otherwise fail to send a card. Maybe you failed to send it because you don't actually have it in your inventory. You can send cards you weren't supposed to send, so essentially extra inventory. You can send a card that's, say, the wrong version, even though that's kind of extra inventory of the wrong version and failing to send inventory of the correct version. And in the same way, you can send a card that is a lower grade than what you should have sent. I don't think TCGplayer gets angry if you send a card that's too high of a grade. I've never seen that, and I guess they really shouldn't. But so those are the main kinds of discrepancies, and depending on where you get your inventory and what your inventory is made up of, you can struggle with different types of discrepancies in different amounts. So if you're buying a whole lot of, say, little collections locally, and then you're sifting those for value and putting that up onto direct to sell, your issues are going to be more related around proper condition grading. If you're cracking a bunch of new boxes, you're a box breaker and you're putting up pack fresh cards, then your conditions are probably, or your issues, your discrepancies are more focused around getting the correct variant of the card. And I have certainly had trouble with that, where subtle difference in variations have caused me to have problems and discrepancies on my replenishment invoices. So essentially, this entire process of taking in the replenishments and inspecting them is very labor intensive for TCGplayer, and obviously they would like that to become less labor intensive. And so, like I said, several weeks or maybe a month ago now, they put out an email warning sellers that basically you're going to have to improve, and that standards were going to come in place, and that TCGplayer was going to start telling people that they were on notice, and they were going to start giving them what their actual metrics for discrepancies were. And so then TCGplayer sent out an email to, I guess, all the sellers. I got one, even though I have a very low discrepancy rate, under 1%. And everyone kind of got that official email of, here's what your discrepancy is. And then a little while after that, I'm not exactly sure how many days, some people started getting kicked out of the direct program for having discrepancy rates that were too high. And so I talked with one of my patrons who got kicked out of the direct program, unfortunately, and they felt that they didn't really have time to get a handle on things and make good adjustments, and they said they were improving, but that they did not have time to improve sufficiently, or they did not have sufficient time, they felt. So that's kind of the backstory to all of this. And so then I'll tell a second story that goes with it, which is in the last, say, 6 weeks, I have gotten a lot of emails from the Roca group at TCGplayer. And you might remember about 2 years ago, I believe, TCGplayer purchased a company called Roca that made card sorting robots. And basically, if you're in the direct program, they will give you the sales pitch of why a card sorting robot may be good for your business. And it's very low pressure, and the sales guys are pretty good. They're pretty good at answering the technical questions and helping you out and helping you figure out if it's good for your business or when it might be good for your business. But I've started getting a lot of those emails, and probably 5 or 6 in the last 2 months. And they're just kind of the cold call type of sales messages where it's like, Roca could improve your efficiency, or you could save tons of money with Roca, or whatever. You know, they're just trying to remind you that Roca exists, these card sorting robots exist, and you could get one. And I've been thinking about this a lot for about a week now. And I realized, talking to the patron of mine who unfortunately got kicked out of the direct program, talking to other patrons of mine who are improving their direct accuracy rates on their replenishment invoices, and specifically asking several of them about if and how many Roca emails they're getting. And what I found is that it seems that TCGplayer is courting those direct sellers who have already shown very high accuracy rates on their replenishment invoices with offers to buy Roca robots. And so I asked myself, what does this look like in the future? If I were TCGplayer, what kind of future would I want to see? And so I put myself in their shoes and I say, well, what I would like is accuracy coming from direct sellers that is essentially whatever the accuracy of the Roca robot is. So I would want the sellers to have 0 errors, and any errors that they do have to have been caused by the card sorting robot. And maybe even for the error rate to be less than the card sorting robot. Essentially, what I would desire is for the sellers to catch errors that the robot makes. Now, that's not always going to be possible because the robot is sorting inventory and he says, well, it's this variant, or it's this card, or it's the list version, or whatever, and it's not. Well, you're probably going to end up in a situation where you do not have the card to send in on a replenishment invoice, and so you're going to get a strike for missing inventory. And so you may not always be able to correct the robot, but in some cases you will be able to. And so if I'm TCGplayer, what I want to see is a future where the only people selling on the platform are ones who operate Roca robots, and they're able to do some small amount of manual improvement in accuracy rate over what the robot does itself. Now, TCGplayer markets the Roca as 99% accurate, which, if you've ever sold cards, especially if you're a box breaker, if you're selling new cards out of boxes you're opening yourself, 99% accuracy sounds abysmal. And the reason they market it as 99% accuracy is they're just rounding up to make it sound nice, right? What they really need is like 99.9. 1 in 1,000 cards has an error, or 99.99, 1 in 10,000 cards has an error. That's what they really need, because if it's only 99%, that means 1 in 100 cards has an error on it, which is really bad when you're sorting, you're trying to pick orders, and you're trying to do replenishment invoices, and you're trying to run a business. But, you know, in my actual video conference calls with the Roca guys, and I asked them about that specifically, and we discussed down in the brass tacks of the statistics, and yes, it is better than 99%. But if you had 99% and then you take what is the human error on top of that, which is going to be coming from your seller themselves who are operating the robots, it's going to be a little bit. It's going to be small. And TCGplayer has said in these last several months that what they think is acceptable for direct sellers is about 2% total error. And so you'll get that error from the Roka robot itself, and you'll get it from the human side on the seller. And so I think this future where they would like to see every seller operating Rokas, and then TCGplayer could substantially scale down the amount of inspection that they need to do on their side when they get replenishment invoices in. I think that's where they would like to go. I know if I were TCGplayer, that's exactly where I'd like to go. I'd like to spend less and less labor dollars on people inside of TCGplayer inspecting those RIs when they come in. And I'd like to put more of that burden onto the sellers and force the sellers to sort it out and become more efficient. Now, what does this mean for everybody? Now, if you're a seller and you have or you can scale up and afford Rokas, hey, you're probably fine. If you're a TCG seller and you can't, or you buy small collections and you sell them, maybe your future is not in the direct program. That's hard to say. And, it just depends on how much intentional downgrading of the condition of the cards you're willing to do in order to not get discrepancies on condition from TCGplayer when you do a replenishment invoice. And if you're in between, which is kind of where I am, your business is not to the point where you could afford a Roka and do that, but you're mainly interested in only doing singles as a box breaker with pack fresh cards, then you can probably survive along and just be less competitive and less efficient. If you're a buyer and you buy cards off of TCGplayer and somehow you've made it this far into a video that is focused on issues surrounding people who sell in the direct program, I don't know why you're still here, but I think it's good for you. I mean, you definitely want to see less friction, less inefficiency in the market, which will ultimately bring down the prices of cards. Before TCGplayer existed, cards were going to be more expensive. When you have an efficient marketplace, it brings down the friction and the prices fall. When you have more sellers, prices fall. When those sellers adopt automation, prices fall. And so all of these things benefit the buyers ultimately. And then it allows the buyers to decide, do we want to spend less money to get the same amount of cards, or do we want to spend the same amount of money and get more cards? And so if you can purchase more volume, sellers get to do more volume, and their businesses have the potential to grow. So that's kind of where I, in an unlikely sense, see things headed over the next couple of years, where a lot more of the small direct sellers get squeezed out of the market. And if we look back at other marketplaces on the internet, this is just kind of a natural progression. We saw Amazon in the early days. People would sign up to Amazon, they would sell things, they would become successful, and then eventually everyone else would pile into that product. And at some point, Amazon themselves would pile into that product, undercut everyone, because Amazon does not pay a market fee on its own marketplace, and it would destroy everyone who had initially proven out that that good or service could be sold on Amazon profitably. Etsy had a similar kind of evolution, where initially they had a lot of handcrafted stuff, and over time the marketplace shifted more and more towards just Chinese made general stuff, and it just became another marketplace, and it squeezed out those early sellers. And maybe this is just kind of the natural evolution of TCGplayer doing its own thing on that path of marketplaces, where fundamentally the bean counters at the higher levels look at what do we want long term for maximizing revenue and profit, and the way to do that is to get accuracy rates in the direct program to over 98%, cut back on the amount of labor on checking orders coming in, and then allowing buyers to buy more cards because of it. So, if you're a buyer, it's really great. And everyone else, hold on, because you may survive, and you may perform very well with it, or you may not. So we'll see. And like I said, I have a very, very low confidence in this theory. It's basically based on a lot of conversations I've had with patrons, emails I've gotten, and other things I've seen happening over the last couple months or two, and just my experience with how the corporate world sadly works. And remember, TCGplayer was bought by eBay, what, 2.5 years ago now? 2 years ago now? It's not going to be sunshine and roses forever. So let me know what you think, guys. Let me know what you're seeing, and I'm interested to see what the feedback on this one is. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.